Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and my guest today is Dr. Eddie Zilber. She was born in a DP persons camp after World War II, and in her retirement, she has researched, documented, and published her family's Holocaust experiences in the book, A Holocaust Memoir of Love and Resistance, Mama's Survival from Lithuania to America. Do you have the book cover to show us?
Sure. Here we go.
Okay. So
My
that's her
parents.
book. Now, let's start. She and I were just talking about, let's start at the beginning. We'll start actually on September 1st, 1939. Lithuania is an independent country. Am I right?
Yeah.
Okay. The Germans march into Poland. And then what happens?
Well, Polish history, basically the war began on
Right.
September 1st, 1939 with the Nazi occupation. There were activities in 1938, but we're not going there.
No.
So, and they took over half of Poland. And at that time, they also entered into an agreement with the Soviets, basically saying it was a non-aggression agreement, and you take half of Europe, and we'll take half of Europe, and we will not fight each other. And so, indeed, the Nazis came into and took over half of Poland, and then eventually the Soviets came in and took over all of the other countries, where we're going to talk about the Baltic countries, the other half of Poland, and numerous other countries in the East.
Okay, but we're going
And
to make a distinction. The
so,
Soviets took over Eastern Poland right away, September, a few couple weeks after September, the beginning in September 39, but they didn't take over the Baltic countries. By the way, I had to put on my website explanation between the Baltic countries and the Balkan countries
yeah, big
because people get
difference.
confused. But they didn't actually get to Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia until June 1940.
Marty.
Okay, so now what happens?
Basically, referring to my family, I'll tell you what happened. The Jews, the Jews had been watching what's going on in Western Europe from 1933, and they knew very, very well that the situation for Jews in Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia was not good. And then there were a number of refugees from Western Poland, where the Nazis had occupied, and they actually got to my parents' city in Kovno, Lithuania. They
But
ran away.
the other name for Kovno is,
Kaunas, correct. Thank
and
you.
which one is the one used today? I always get confused.
Kaunas is the Lithuanian term, and the Jews called every city, the Jews had their own name for the city. And so the Jews called it Kovno, just like Vilnius was Vilna for the Jews. So my aunt remembers very, very well how a refugee family from Poland came to Kovno, and the Jews took them in to help them. And so they heard exactly what was going on in Nazi-occupied Poland. So when the Soviets eventually did come in June 1940, the Jews said, well, they're not killing Jews. At least they're not killing Jews. So the Soviets would protect us from the Nazis. So they thought. And so when the Soviets did come in, they basically said, okay, we have to get with the program. And we know what the Soviet program is. It was anti-religion, anti-capitalism. So all the religious institutions were closed down. And anybody who was a capitalist or had private property, everything was nationalized. And as it was, my grandfather had just built and outfitted a metal foundry factory. And they lived in the foundry also. That was their home. And as soon as the Soviets came in, they were kicked out of the factory. They were kicked out of their home. And as my aunt said, they wouldn't even let us take our dog, you know? Honestly, that's what she remembers. She was a little girl. And so they had to move out. And likewise, all the other people, Lithuanian, whether they were Jewish or not Jewish, it happened the same for all of them. And many of those people, both Jews and Lithuanians, were sent to Siberia. They made lists and people were sent to Siberia. As I found out, my father's family was also put on the list, but they were put on the list to go to Siberia almost a year later. And then the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union
On June 22nd, 1941.
in 1941, exactly. And I had another great uncle who was sent to Siberia from Lithuania. He had a shoe business, and so he was sent off to Siberia. And fortunately, he survived the war in Siberia. So we got a lot of stories from him as well. So back to the invasion by the Nazis. This was a surprise to everybody, including the Soviets.
Yes.
This was called Operation Barbarossa, and it was like a blitz. They came in with full force and attacked all the countries that the Soviet Union had just occupied. And that included my family's country of Lithuania.
I
And
just want to
go
say,
ahead.
I just read what I found was interesting. It was a three-prong attack, and Hitler's three different, so they went to the north, the middle, and the south. And I read that Hitler's generals had said, no, 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 you should just stick with one prong. And he overruled them. Now, whether that helped or not, I have no idea. But I thought that that was very interesting.
Well, Hitler made a lot of decisions that his generals disagreed with, like attack the war on the Jews probably hampered his total war effort
Oh,
all
more than probably.
right. So yes, well, that's what happens when you're dealing with a crazy leader. So back to the attack. My mother remembers very clearly the night of the attack because, as she says, she was a 16-year-old girl and she was coming home from a date.
Oh.
And she watched as in the horizon, off on the horizon, their airport was being bombed. And they realized right away that the Nazis are attacking. And they realized very quickly that their lives would change literally overnight. And that's the thing that I always asked my parents, well, why didn't you run away? Why didn't you get out? Right? It was overnight. In Western Europe, there was 5, 6, 7, 8 years going on. In Eastern Europe, in the Baltics, it was overnight. It wasn't expected, and that was a huge shock to everybody. And this is the moment that in Holocaust literature we call it choiceless choices. In a moment like that, everybody has to make a choice. What do you do? So my mother's family, they decided we're going to try to escape toward the Soviet Union with all the troops. Mind you, the troops never fought back. That
That,
were the ones that were in Lithuania never
that's an
fought back.
important point to emphasize.
Absolutely. They did not fight back. And they immediately retreated back to the Soviet Union. And so many Jews took the decision, well, let's try to get to the Soviet Union. So they literally walked. All the roads were packed with people trying to escape the city. And my mother's family was in that situation. But my father's family had a different choiceless choice. My father's family, my grandfather was a businessman and he had business colleagues, and he had some Lithuanian non-Jewish friends who he trusted. And one of them whispered in his ear and said, no matter what happens in the next few days, don't leave the house. Don't leave the house. He obviously knew what was being planned, and this was planned in advance. And so my grandfather and the family stayed in the house. I mean, they even talk about not having enough food. And so here, two families, And both of them, each of them had a different decision, different choice. Choice was
Joyce.
choice. Okay, so my mother's family is out on the road trying to get to the Soviet Union, over to Russia, and with tens of thousands of other people. And people were being shot along the way, and people were being killed from air attacks, as well as Lithuanian Auxiliary Forces, the LAF. And it turns out that the Lithuanian Nazis had already prepared an attack on the Jews. It was prepared even before the attack on the Soviets because the Lithuanian government in exile was very, how should I say, cushy with Hitler back in Berlin. They were in exile in Berlin. And so they erroneously believed that if they helped Hitler do his bidding and get rid of the Jews, that they would be granted independence.
Mm.
Well, Hitler had no intention of giving them independence, but they didn't know it. So they tried to be nice to Hitler and help him out with his job. So that's the reason my grandfather's family was warned not to leave the house because this man knew that there would be an attack on the Jews. So back on the road, those same Lithuanian auxiliary forces arrested all the people that were trying to escape toward Russia, and that included my mother and her family. They were arrested and they were brought back to the city. And meanwhile, in the city, it was a huge pogrom against Jews. Jews were massacred, the buildings were looted, burned to the ground, synagogues were burned down. Anybody found on the street, any Jew found on the street was murdered. And then eventually they arrested any of the Jews that they found, mostly men, and they took them all to a place called the Seventh Fort. The
Mm.
city of Kovno or Kaunas was encircled by 9 forts, which were built back in the Tsar's time, for protection, like many other cities in Europe. And these forts became de facto killing sites. So all the people who had been arrested, and this is before the Nazis actually went in and occupied the city, they were all brought to the Seventh Fort.
Oh, wait,
And
but not the people arrested on the road yet.
oh, yeah, they were brought back to the city and they were brought to the Seventh Fort
Okay,
as well.
just clarifying.
There
Okay.
we go. Yeah. So my mother and her family were brought up to the Seventh Fort. Now, this is June and the beginning of July already. And it's summer and it gets hot. And all of these people were brought to the fort. The men were separated from the women. The men were kept outside, and the women were and children were kept inside the fort. And in small groups, the women saw the through the window, and they heard that everybody was being shot. All right. Now, who was doing the shooting? The guards were all the Lithuanians. By this time, the Einsatzgruppen had come into Eastern Europe. These are mobile killing units that followed the military into Eastern Europe.
These are
And
Germans, these are Germans.
Germans, yes, yes, absolutely. These were Nazis. And they came in behind the troops. And there were 4 such killing units. And the one that came into uh, Kaunas, Kovno, was Einsatzgruppen A. There was A, B, C, and D going all the way south. And so they came in as well and they set up shop to do the killing. And so in groups, the men were taken to the back of the fort and they were shot. And the women and the children inside saw this and listened to it, and they were sure that my grandfather was killed that day. And then one day the Nazis released the women and children. They said, okay, you can go home. So they walked home and they're trying to figure out how they're going to live now without Papa. And one day, Papa walked into the house and he told them the story of what happened to him at the fort. First, they took them to the back of the fort, so they had been arrested. Then they took them to the back of the fort and they gave them shovels. They said, okay, start digging basically
Your grave.
graves, pits. And they dug the pits and then they told them to undress. Now, each of these steps are part of what we now call the Holocaust by bullets,
Yeah.
which has been investigated by an organization called Yachad in Im Unam. A French Catholic priest, Patrick Dubois, was the spearhead for this organization. So they had steps, and they carried out these steps in every village, in every city in the ex-Soviet Union countries. So they had them march in, they had them dig their pits. Sometimes the pits were already dug by local people. They had them undress, and then in small groups, they had them walk up to the pit, and they were shot and fell into the pit. Another strategy was they would walk down into the pit, lie down on top of other dead bodies, and they would be shot from above. So that was the strategy. And then the all the clothing in this process was then kept. All right. They went through it to find valuables. All the clothing was kept and either um, kept by the Nazis or distributed to their helpers. And they were often sold on auction on the roads. And then the shooting, and that was the process. And so while my grandfather was getting undressed, he realized that in his pocket he always kept his military medal.
Hmm.
He was a volunteer for the Lithuanian military in their War of Independence in 1918. And he was given a medal, and he was very proud of this medal, and he always kept it in his pocket. And he pulls out the medal and he shows it to the Lithuanian guard. He says, look, you're about to kill a Savanoris. You're about to kill a volunteer. And they were held in great esteem in Lithuania. So the kid pulled him out of line and sent him to the Gestapo prison instead. And that's how he didn't get murdered that day. And in the Gestapo prison, he was forced to work there, cleaning the prison. And eventually, he was a butcher by profession. And eventually, he got a job in the Gestapo kitchen. And there was no better job during the Holocaust
Yeah.
than being in a kitchen. But he was so filthy, dirty from all that time in being a prisoner that, of course, they wouldn't let him touch their food. So they took him home with a Nazi guard behind them, and so he could wash. And that's when they heard the story. I mean, can you imagine? All of a sudden, they're sure he's dead, and he walks in the door. So this was one of the highlights of the moment. And indeed, every day he went to work. He was escorted to work in the Gestapo. And at night, he was brought back home. And needless to say, he brought food with him when he did. So my mother's family had access to some food during these times when everybody else in the ghetto, and that was the next step, everyone else in the ghetto was starving. They were starving. So fast forward, the next step after the Nazis came in were
Wait.
the,
I am a little confused. Did your mother and father
okay,
know each other at this time?
no, no, they
Okay.
were both young teenagers and they didn't know each other. They actually met and fell in love in the ghetto. And against all prohibitions against getting married, they actually got married in the ghetto. So that's another little tidbit when we get to talking about life in the ghetto. So yes, so now the next decrees, a whole list of decrees that came out, just like in Western Europe. Um, the next one was the yellow star, of course, to identify everybody. And the next big one was everybody had to move into the ghetto. And there were about 30,000 Jews in the city. And the area that they assigned for the ghetto was about big enough for 7,000. So, needless to say, two, three families had to live together in these tiny shacks because it was a decrepit area of the city.
I just remembered it's the very poor section of the city. I just said,
Always, always, always. You're right. And so when we think of ghetto, we just think of a neighborhood, but this was a prison. It was totally enclosed in barbed wire with armed guards and sentry posts all around. So it was a prison, although they were living together in houses and with their families. So the ghetto years were horrific. Basically, it was horrific. They were there to work for the Nazis. That was the main thing. The Jews actually, the whole the success of the Nazis industry, shall we say, was a lot of deception. Aside from terror, a lot of deception. Every step of the way, they made up a story. Well, now we're just going to send you for work, and there's more food there. And now you'll be able to be with your family. And so it's better accommodations for you. Every time they moved them, every time they sent them somewhere, it was always surrounded by deception all the time. And this ghetto was one of the longest ones, other than the Warsaw Ghetto. They were there for 3 years, 3 years from 41 to 44. And so life was abysmal in the ghetto. There was starvation, there was disease, there was abuse. It was horrific, and there was also killing going on. But they wanted the people to work for them. And what does it mean for them? So that an example would be the airport that was bombed originally by the Nazis. Now they had thousands of Jews walking to the airport to fix it so they could use it. And my mother was in that workforce. She had to go and schlep rocks and do help with cement and whatever they did to fix the airport. Everybody had to work. Anybody over the age of 12 had to work. And so there were different kinds of jobs, and there were better jobs and there were worse jobs. Going to fix the airport was the worst, the worst. All different weather conditions, and it was a horrible thing.
now wait,
But
wait, what was your father doing at this point?
okay, so now my father's family, as I said, they stayed in the house when the attacks started. All right, but they had to move to the ghetto also. And
But
so
they never
eventually,
went to the fortress.
no, they never went to the fortress, exactly. And they moved into the ghetto like all the other Jews, and they still were not near each other and they didn't know each other in the ghetto. That came a bit later. And they also were given a small living quarters there. And my grandfather, because he was an electrician and a mechanic, just like my father, both he and my father got jobs as electricians and mechanics. And so that was a job where sometimes you'd get a bowl of soup and you didn't have to go out and work in the elements, and it was a better kind of job. So definitely those who had certain skills had a better chance of survival. But everybody had to work, and later on they set up these workshops. The Nazis allowed them to set up workshops to make clothing, to make toys for children, boots and shoes, leather workshop. It wasn't for the Jews. It was for the Nazis to send back to their families in Germany. And so that was a better kind of job in the ghetto. So every single kind of job you had, it impacted how you and your family could survive. If you could smuggle some food into the ghetto, many times the Jews were taken out to factories and companies outside the ghetto, just like in the movie Schindler's List. They worked in someone else's factory, and the owner of the factory paid the Reich for the slave labor. And so that was a good job. Why? Because they had an opportunity to barter for food when they were out in the city. And so they would try to smuggle food in for their families. But every time they came back to the ghetto, there was a checkpoint. They were checked to see if they were smuggling anything, and it was forbidden to smuggle. So in the best case scenario, the food was confiscated. In the worst case scenario, they were beaten up or killed. So pick your poison. But that was a form of resistance
Yes.
that they continued with even despite the danger and the risk. Because another thing people don't understand, if you did something against the rules, it wasn't just you that was punished. They believed in collective punishment. So it was you, it was your family, and sometimes it was the whole street of houses where you lived. Everybody would be punished. And so people thought twice before breaking the rules, but there was always still resistance going on in the ghetto. So that's what was going on for 3 years in Kovno, as we call it, Kaunas, in the ghetto. And eh, both of my parents' families, they were all working. In my mother's family, she had three younger sisters, right? And so they were not working. But my mother would go out to work sometimes instead of my grandmother, so that my grandmother could stay home and take care of the kids, and my mother took her place in another job. But officially, both of them had to be working. All of them had to be working. And so that's sort of the short story of the ghetto. And every time in the ghetto, there were selections. And the big selection came in October of 1941. They moved into the ghetto in August 41. In October, by that time, there were about 25,000 Jews left. Everybody had to line up in this big space, open square, in family groups. And there was the selector, and his name was Sergeant Rauka. And he sat there with his little stick and a sandwich in his hand, or some food or drink or whatever. And he pointed to each person as they came by, right or left, right or left. And one line was for life and the other line was for death, but they didn't know it at the time.
And this is
And
not by family group. Although they stood by family group, he still separated out family members.
correct, correct. So if there was a mother with young children, she was definitely sent to the bad line. If it was a teenager, and teenagers mostly survived the Holocaust. Of all the survivors, the age group that survived was between 15 and 25, right? Because they could work. And so yeah, families were divided for sure, based on what you looked like, right? And so almost 10,000 Jews were selected that day. It was 2 days. And they were taken up the hill from the ghetto, up the hill to the ninth fort. That was the ninth one. The previous one was the seventh. Now, you could see the hill from the ghetto. And so there are many drawings. After the war, there were drawings made of that scene where everybody was watching. 10,000 of their relatives and our family members were up there too, being marched up the hill to their death at the ninth fort. And that was indeed another killing field. And not only Lithuanian Jews were killed at the ninth fort, they have evidence of Jews from France being transferred all the way across to Eastern Europe to be murdered at the ninth fort. And they were told they were being transferred for work in the East. So they were dressed nicely.
Mhm.
They were coming straight from France. They were sitting in regular uh, train cars, not cattle cars.
Interesting.
And we have all of this evidence from an eyewitness who was a very close friend of my parents. He was a prisoner in the Ninth Fort, and he was the one, amongst the prisoners who had to bury the corpses. And then, as time was passing and the Nazis realized they had to get rid of the evidence, he was part of what they called the Sonderkommando, that had to dig up the dead bodies who were there already for 3 years and burn them. And he was part of the famous escape from the Ninth Fort. There were 63 prisoners, Jews and Soviet prisoners of war. They were up there together as prisoners, and they came up with an escape plan, and they succeeded. And this is one of the stories. It's been there are testimonies to this. It's one of these unheard of stories. Not all of them survived the escape, but my parents' friend did. And he's written about it, he's spoken about it, and he's given testimony about everything that happened up at the Ninth Fort. So indeed, that was another killing field.
Wait,
And
wait, I
in
want to
total,
know, did this
mhm,
include your mother's younger sisters?
no, no, they were not up there then. It included some aunts, and my great grandmother was up there, and many other relatives and friends, obviously, from 10,000 people, um, just almost 10,000. And that was a killing field, and they were all murdered in the pits, and eventually they were pulled out of the pits to be burned, but they never managed to burn all of them. So when the Soviets liberated the city in 1944, 44 they liberated the city.
What month?
August 1st, 1944, they liberated the city. They dug up the graves they were looking for evidence. They kept their own records, the Soviets. We never got access to those records. When I say we, I mean in the West. We never had access to those records until the Soviet Union collapsed. So we never really knew a lot of this information until the early 90s. And so yeah, there's proof of what happened up there. If people need additional proof, there is proof of that. And so eventually, back down in the ghetto, people were being sent out to different labor camps, and the conditions there were abysmal. So most people were dying in the labor camps. Um, and eventually, the Nazis realized that they're not in a good position. So, if we're going to fast forward to early 1944, the Jews actually heard the Soviets approaching. They could hear the guns, they could hear the cannons, they knew they were close. And of course, they also knew that as soon as you get toward the end of a war, you're not necessarily safe. And that was definitely the case here. I'm skipping over a lot of things, so stop me at any
No,
time. I
no,
can go on
because we have a
forever.
limited time, and I'm
Go right
fascinated,
ahead.
but I'm trying to limit my questions to moving. But did we skip when your parents got married?
Okay, we did. So every time in the ghetto, there was a different, what they called aktia, an action or a roundup. And so there were roundups for books, and there were roundups for valuables, and there were roundups for also. And then one day they came in and they rounded up all the children under the age of 12 and all the elderly, and they sent them to be killed. I had three aunts under the age of 12, but by that time, many of the Jews in the ghettos had built themselves hideouts. The Nazis knew about this, but they had hideouts. And so my three aunts were hidden in the hideout. Unfortunately, they weren't found. And that was called the Kinderaktie. And that was in March 1944. Now, in the meantime, my mother and father had met in the ghetto, and they started going out together, and they fell in love. And after the Kinderaktie, they knew that time was limited. The Russians are coming, there's going to be a fight, it isn't going to be good. And they didn't know if they would survive it. So they decided to get married. Now, one of the rules in the ghetto was no marriages, no pregnancies, no giving birth.
Wait, these the German rules.
German rules, yes, penalty of death. And my parents said, well, what the heck? We don't know if we're going to survive or not. We're going to get married anyway. And they did. They brought in a rabbi, and he married them. And they didn't know when the end was, but they knew it was coming soon. And then and this was now in June 1944. And literally 2 weeks later, my father came to my mother and he says, "Listen, I have an opportunity to escape. The Nazis are preparing their retreat." Literally, the Soviets were down the road and they're preparing their retreat. They need mechanics to check their Jeeps and their trucks and their cars and everything. And so they grabbed a bunch of mechanics from the ghetto. And my father and the other guys made a decision that they're going to try to escape from this opportunity. So they were taken out of the ghetto to where the trucks were. And they did what they did. They punctured the tires, they pulled the plugs, and they made an escape. Not all of them survived the escape because the Nazis came after them, of course, with the German shepherds. And my father was fortunate that he managed to survive the escape as well. That's a whole other story. But back in the ghetto, they knew that a lot of the Jews were hiding. And so they just set fire to the whole ghetto. They bombed it and they burned it down. So anybody who was hiding was burned to death. And that's where one of my aunts, my mother's younger sister, was killed in the hideout. She was burned to death. My mother was also hiding in a hideout with some friends and other family members. And the way she describes it is the smoke got so bad they couldn't breathe. So they knew they were going to die there. So once again, here's that choiceless choice, right? You either stay there and burn to death, which is not pretty, or you try to get out and you're either going to be shot or arrested. And they decided to get out of the hiding place. And indeed, the Nazis arrested them and took them to the trains and sent them to the concentration camps. And so that's just a picture of what happened in the ghetto at the liquidation. They literally call it liquidation. And so my mother and her family and my father's family were sent to the camps. The men were sent to a subcamp of Dachau, all the way down to Germany.
Right. Come here.
They were sent to this labor camp called Kaufering, where Hitler thought he had the dream that he could recreate his Messerschmitt fighter jet, and then he would win the war. And so they were working on that, and the conditions there were beyond abysmal. The women were sent to a different camp, Stutthof, which is on the Baltic Sea next to Gdansk,
Right.
right on
I
the
know it.
water. And it was only the women that went there, but
Wait. Gdansk
yeah,
is also Danzig. Okay, go ahead.
Danzig, correct. So that camp had a lot of Polish prisoners from for quite a while, but only the women from Kovno were sent to Stutthof. And they were also sent out to labor camps, and they were working, and my mother describes the different kinds of work she had to do. But when the Nazis started to retreat in general, the policy was take the prisoners with you. And that has come to be known as the death marches. They called it evacuations, but the Jews called it the death marches because this is winter in Poland or in Germany. It's cold, and all they're wearing is the pajamas and the wooden clogs. And they're taken on these marches. And you can use your imagination. What was that like? That most of the people died on the way.
Yeah, we
And
forgot to say usually they had no food on these
and they
marches.
had no food. And she describes just grabbing snow and chewing on the snow, and that was it basically. And if you stopped for any reason, you would just be shot right there. So the death march was exactly that. It was a death march. And eventually they slept in barns, they slept wherever they could, and this is the short story. And eventually they wound up in this little barn in a town called Chinowie in northern Poland. And one morning they woke up and their Nazi guards were gone. And within a few hours, the Soviets came in, and that's when they realized they were liberated. And that was March 1945. The war didn't end till May officially, right? So this was their liberation. And most of them were half dead. They were sick. They all had typhus. And they were either in the middle of typhus, or they were already dead from typhus, or they were struggling to get through typhus. And my mother got typhus, and her friend got typhus, and they tried to help each other through that. And now they're under the Soviets, and that was her liberation. Now, back in Dachau, my two grandfathers were working in the labor camp, and my mother's father didn't survive it. He was very, very sick. He was abused. He was starved, and he died there. And I have his death certificate I acquired. And by the way, I acquired my mother's registration forms from Stutthof. My
Hmm.
mother, my grandmother, and the two younger sisters. I have all four registration forms with their signatures from that I went to get in Stutthof. And the same thing with Dachau. Those who were still alive were marched out of Dachau. And so my surviving grandfather was on that march as well. And he was liberated sometime toward the end of April in southern Germany.
And wait, where
And
was your father?
my father had escaped. He was
I
still in
know.
Kovno. He's now under the Soviets.
Yeah, but oh, okay. So he's right,
He stayed there. He never went to a camp. He never went to a concentration camp. He escaped from the garage
right.
and he hid out, and he only had to hide for less than a month
Got
because
it.
the Soviets came in August 1st. So he was liberated in 1944. And the rest of the family, each one of them was liberated at a different time by a different army. So my grandfather was liberated by the Americans. My mother and my grandmother and two surviving aunts were liberated by the Soviets. They weren't together on the death march. They were on two different
Right,
death marches.
right. No, that is you
So
made it
they
very
were
clear.
liberated by the Soviets. And my father was still in their hometown, and he was liberated by the Soviets as well. So that's the short story of that period of time. Um, in Kovno, and this was a typical story throughout Lithuania and the other Baltic countries, including Latvia and Estonia. And small variations, but pretty much the melody is the same in all of those countries. And tell me what else you'd like to know.
Well, no, I think you've done a fabulous job. And again, the Baltics are in the north, the
Yes.
Balkans are in the south. And just and my mother's family comes from a small town in Latvia. Most of them left before World War II, but some of them had not left, and two of them survived because they were teens
Yep.
and they lived in a village, Vishki, but they were in Riga doing war work. And when the Nazis broke the pact, they ran east with the Soviets. I mean, not because they
Ah,
were Jews.
yes. Yes. It was easier for the Latvians and Estonians to cross over because of the geography. So a lot of Latvians and Estonians survived because they escaped. And the Lithuanians never managed to, it was already too late for the Lithuanians to get across.
So,
For a period of time, the Russians closed the border, but then they opened the border. And anybody who got in at the right time, right place was lucky.
and
Yeah.
so my second cousin Bruce Dumas has done a lot of research, and he's connected us with that because all the time I grew up, I thought I had no connection to the Holocaust, and then it turns out, yes, I did.
Discovered you did. That's right. That's right. And it, we're very lucky in that, most survivors don't even have one photograph of a mother, a child, anybody in their family. It's almost like a second persecution. Because after time you forget what your mother looked like, you forget what your child looked like. I mean, how horrible is that? We were lucky in that we had a lot of relatives outside Europe before the war. And my grandparents used to send out, New Year's cards and holiday cards, and they would always put in a photo of the family. And so all these relatives around the world had photos of our family. And so after the war, my mother and my grandmother both contacted all of those relatives and said, please send us any copies you have of photos. So I grew up with a lot of photos of family, so I knew what they looked like. And even when the Nazis attacked the city, my mother's mother had the foresight to give a few photos, family photos, to a trusted neighbor. And she gave her but she was afraid to be caught with these photos. So she hid them in the straw mattress. So they were in the mattress for 4 years. So they got all wrinkled, but my mother had them fixed up after the war. So we're lucky that we have photos, but I would say the majority of survivors never even were able to recuperate a photo of a family member. And I can't imagine how horrible that is.
I have this memory when the TV show Holocaust came out in like 78 or 79. And there's a scene in which the mother is going to the gas chamber and she still has pictures of the family.
Yeah.
And I don't remember. No one emailed me and say I got this wrong. But I remember thinking how she'd been able to hold on to those photos because in theory she would have already been stripped when they got to Auschwitz. But I think, for dramatic purposes, they wanted to show as she got undressed the photos.
Yeah.
That I've
Interesting. The odd thing is when I travel in Eastern Europe and, I love to go into antique shops and they have boxes and boxes of old photos. And I,
really,
oh yeah, all antique shops, they have all sorts of interesting things. But every time I went into an antique shop there, I thought, oh, where did this come from? So yeah, yeah. And they, getting back to the deception, they were always told, bring money with you, bring warm clothes, bring some food for 3 days, so the individual thinks, okay, we'll pack up some stuff. So they take their valuables, they take their jewelry, they take their money, photos, of course, candlesticks, and of course, every single thing they packed was taken from them. And many don't realize that not only was it the biggest genocide in history, it was also the biggest robbery in history.
yes, yes.
And everything was robbed, down from the little photograph, underwear, shoes, to real estate, bank accounts, life insurance policies, and art. I mean, it was a big robbery too.
I do remember reading a true account of a Dutch Jewish survivor who, when they came, the Gestapo or the SS came to their house in Holland, take them, the father said to the daughter, because it was summer, go put your winter boots on. And she
Hmm.
said, you didn't argue with your father, and
Right.
it saved her life.
That's right. The best thing you could have were good boots, was good
Right.
boots, no
And the
question.
other thing that I will say is one of my deepest regrets, I'll try not to get emotional about it, is I knew so little about the Holocaust, not coming from a Holocaust family, my husband not coming from a Holocaust family. We were stationed in Germany in 1970 to 72 in all those little antique shops.
Yeah.
Not that we had any money, but could we have gone in and found menorahs, maybe like really discounted? Could we have rescued some of those? But
Yeah.
but we knew nothing. So we tried to visit the Jewish sites of Europe. That wasn't easy to find in those years, by the way. My
Yeah.
mother found a Jewish travel guide printed in England that she sent to us before the internet, for those of you who have no idea what it was like to find anything
Yeah. Yeah.
beforehand.
Another thing that I think that many don't realize when I mentioned earlier Holocaust by bullets, many people have this idea in their head that Holocaust equals concentration camp and gas chamber. Well, as it turns out, we now have documentation, very good documentation, about how over 2 million Jews were killed right in their hometown.
Out of the 6
Never
million. Why
saw,
do I say this? Because I never give anyone the chance to say there was only 2 million. Okay, out of six. Okay.
that's right, out of six. Thank you. Yes, you're right. They were killed by bullets. They never got on a train to a concentration camp. They never saw a concentration camp. Gas chambers weren't yet established as we know them today. And so these killing units, these mobile killing units, killed over 2 million Jews in the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Europe. And how do we have the evidence of all of that now? Sure, certainly the Soviets, when they re-entered their cities, they found evidence of bodies. But the one who really needs to get the credit today is a French Jesuit priest named Patrick Dubois. And he established an organization called Yachad im Unum. And he, with his team, went into thousands of villages in Eastern Europe. Number one, they interviewed and recorded eyewitnesses of the oldest people in the town who were children and were eyewitnesses to all of these murders. Many of us thought for a while, even my mother thought, that all of this was done at night. Nobody knew about it. It was secret. No, it was done in broad daylight. And the townspeople came out to see the spectacle of their townspeople being murdered by bullets, being killed, being taken away to a forest area right outside the town. And many recorded that they were let out of school so that the kids in school could go and watch, field trip. And and he recorded every one of those testimonies, and he recorded every site, every killing pit, because these eyewitnesses took him by the hand and showed him exactly where it was, and then they came with their technology, and they established the GPS, the coordinates for every single pit, and there were estimates of way over 2,000 such sites all around Eastern Europe. And so he needs to get a lot of credit, him and his team, for recording this for posterity, because, there are still people who say it didn't happen.
I'm just going to say as we end this that I'm going to add his organization has the killing map. So
Yes,
I'm going
yes,
to add that link underneath her. And
very good.
on the Latvia Vishki one, I noticed there's a killing site on either side of the village. They didn't
Yeah.
just have one, they had two.
Yes,
But anyway,
yes.
I'm going to include that with your interview, Eddie, so that people can check out that killing fields map. And this has been, unfortunately, I guess you could say that, a fascinating talk, if you know what I mean by unfortunately, that this
Absolutely.
ever had to be discussed. But it's very important that it be discussed, that people understand. I always try and tell people it's not just the camps. We need to look much farther afield and learn as much as we can about all the different places. So, Eddie, I thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. And as I end every one of these episodes, things you didn't know about the Holocaust, I say, may the memories of the victims and those who tried to save them be a blessing forever.